The Great War had ended, but victory felt hollow. Europe was a continent of ghosts. Towns lay in ruins, families were shattered, and millions of soldiers returned home, carrying wounds that would never truly heal. The trenches were silent now, but in that silence, the seeds of the next war were already taking root. In November 1918, Germany signed an armistice it didn't fully understand. Its people believed they were agreeing to peace, not surrender. But the men who signed it, in a train carriage in the forests of Compiègne, had ended a war with humiliation. They returned home, branded as traitors by their own people. A poisonous myth began to spread through German streets and beer halls, the stab in the back legend. The belief that Germany's brave soldiers had never truly been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by politicians, communists, and Jews at home. That lie would become a weapon far more dangerous than any artillery shell. At the Versailles Peace Conference in 1919, the victors, Britain, France, and the United States, gathered to reshape the world. But the map they drew was written in bitterness. France wanted vengeance. Britain wanted security. And America, under President Woodrow Wilson, wanted an idealistic peace based on his 14 points. None of them got exactly what they wanted. The resulting treaty was a compromise built on anger. Germany was forced to accept full blame for the war under Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. It was ordered to pay crippling reparations, lose its colonies, and surrender vast territories, including Alsace-Lorraine to France, and the Polish corridor that split Germany in two. Its once proud army was reduced to 100,000 men, without tanks, planes, or submarines. To the Allied powers, it was justice. To Germany, it was humiliation. Millions of Germans read the treaty with disbelief, tears, and rage. One British diplomat, John Maynard Keynes, called the treaty a Carthaginian peace, one that would breed hatred for generations. He was right. The German people felt betrayed not only by their enemies, but by their leaders, by the Weimar Republic, the fragile democracy that replaced the Kaiser's empire. The Republic was born in chaos, uprisings, assassinations, and economic collapse. Communists and monarchists fought in the streets. The old generals sneered at the new government. And in the shadows, men who could not accept defeat whispered that Germany would rise again. The early 1920s brought no relief. Reparations payments strangled the economy. In 1923, the French occupied the Ruhr Valley, Germany's industrial heart, to force the payments through. Workers went on strike. The government printed more money to support them. And then, money itself became worthless. A loaf of bread that had cost 1 mark before the war now cost billions. Children played with stacks of banknotes. People carried wages in wheelbarrows. The middle class, the backbone of any stable nation, was wiped out overnight. In these years of despair, something dark began to take shape. A longing for order, for strength, for pride. Many Germans started to believe democracy had failed them. They didn't want debate. They wanted someone to blame. Across Europe, the same pattern unfolded. Italy, victorious but unsatisfied, fell into turmoil. Russia, shattered by revolution, became the Soviet Union, a new kind of threat that terrified the West. The United States withdrew into isolation, turning its back on Europe's problems. And the League of Nations, the great hope for world peace, was little more than a debating club without an army. The Great War had ended, yes, but the peace that followed was fragile, angry, and poisoned by fear. People wanted stability, but the world they'd inherited was unstable by design. Borders drawn without logic. Empires replaced by fragile states. And in the heart of Europe, a defeated nation burned with resentment. In the ruins of Munich's beer halls, angry veterans and nationalists shouted about betrayal and revenge. Among them was a man with a sharp mustache and a sharper tongue, a failed artist named Adolf Hitler. He listened, he watched, he waited, and soon he would speak. Germany in the early 1920s was a wounded animal, bleeding, desperate, and humiliated, yet still alive. In the chaos of defeat and hunger, radical voices began to echo across beer halls and crowded streets. They promised to restore dignity, to rebuild strength, to make the world fear Germany again. And among those voices, one began to rise above the rest, fierce, magnetic, and dangerous. His name was Adolf Hitler. Born in Austria, he was a failed artist, a loner, and a soldier of the Great War. He had fought in the trenches, been wounded, and felt the collapse of his country like a personal betrayal. When the fighting stopped, he didn't return to ordinary life. He found a new battlefield: politics. In 1919, Hitler joined a small nationalist group, the German Workers' Party. It had only a handful of members, but it gave him what he needed: an audience. Soon, his fiery speeches filled beer halls. He spoke of betrayal, of enemies within, of the dream of a greater Germany. He turned anger into energy, fear into fury. People who felt voiceless suddenly had a man who shouted their pain back at them, louder, sharper, and more dangerous. By 1920, the party changed its name to the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the Nazi Party. Its symbol, a twisted black swastika. Its promise, strength, unity, and revenge. Hitler was no ordinary speaker. He knew how to turn silence into tension, how to make his audience feel they were part of something larger than life. He offered simple answers to complex problems. Germany's misery, he said, was not fate. It was betrayal. And he told the people exactly who to blame: Jews, communists, and the politicians who had signed the Treaty of Versailles. The crowd didn't question. They cheered. In 1923, inspired by Mussolini's fascist march on Rome, Hitler decided to take power himself. He led hundreds of armed supporters into the streets of Munich, the beer hall Putsch. They stormed into a government meeting, fired shots into the air, and declared a national revolution. But the coup collapsed by morning. 16 Nazis were dead. Hitler was arrested. It should have ended his career. Instead, it made him famous. At his trial, Hitler turned the courtroom into a stage. He admitted his guilt, but claimed it was Germany itself that had been betrayed. His speeches were printed in newspapers across the country. To some, he was a lunatic. To others, a hero. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but served less than 1. Behind bars, he wrote a book, Mein Kampf, My Struggle. Page by page, he poured out his hatred, his vision, his obsession with racial purity and revenge. He believed Germans were a master race, destined to rule over others. He dreamed of an empire stretching across Europe, built on war and blood. Few read it seriously at the time, but every line was a warning of what was to come. When Hitler left prison in 1924, Germany seemed calmer. The economy was slowly recovering with American loans. For a few brief years, hope returned. Cafes filled again, streets felt safer. The Weimar Republic, fragile as it was, began to stand, but it was only standing on borrowed time. While Germany tried to rebuild, other nations faced their own storms. In Italy, a new power had already risen. Benito Mussolini, a former socialist turned nationalist, Mussolini promised to make Italy strong again. He wore black uniforms, raised the Roman salute, and spoke of empire. His movement, Fascism, glorified the state above the individual, discipline above freedom, and war above peace. In 1922, his march on Rome brought him to power. The world watched as democracy in Italy quietly died. Mussolini's success became a blueprint for every dictator who followed, including Hitler himself. Across the continent, democracy looked weak. In Spain, in Hungary, in Poland, strongmen seized control. Even in Britain and France, exhausted by the last war, people began to question whether democracy could protect them from the chaos of modern times. By the late 1920s, Hitler's Nazi Party was small and fading. Germany was finally finding its footing. The streets were calm again, the currency stable. For a moment, it seemed the storm had passed. Then, in 1929, the world stopped turning. The Great Depression hit like a sledgehammer. Stock markets collapsed. Factories shut down. Banks closed their doors. Millions were thrown into unemployment and despair. And once again, Germany suffered most of all. American loans vanished overnight. Businesses failed. Hunger returned. People searched desperately for someone to save them, or someone to blame. The Weimar government looked helpless. Parliament fractured into shouting, useless factions. In that chaos, Hitler returned to the stage, louder, angrier, and far more dangerous than before. He promised jobs. He promised pride. He promised revenge. By 1932, the Nazi Party became the largest in Germany's parliament. Brown-shirted stormtroopers filled the streets, marching with torches and banners. Opponents were beaten, newspapers silenced, fear spread like wildfire. Germany, once a land of poets and thinkers, was now a nation trembling between hope and hate. In January 1933, the aging President Paul von Hindenburg made a fateful decision. Believing he could control Hitler, he appointed him Chancellor of Germany. It was meant as a political compromise. It became the death of democracy. Within months, the Nazis seized full control. The Reichstag fire gave Hitler the excuse to crush his opponents. The Enabling Act gave him dictatorial power. Trade unions were banned, opposition parties outlawed, and Germany's free press silenced. One by one, freedoms vanished. By the end of 1933, Hitler stood unchallenged, the Führer of a new Germany. The flags, the marches, the rallies, they gave the illusion of unity. But behind the spectacle, a nightmare was forming. The world had watched the rise of a dictator before, in Italy. Now it was happening again, in the heart of Europe. Few yet realized it, but the age of dictators had begun. Germany in 1933 was reborn, or so it seemed. Banners hung from every window. Marching bands filled the streets. Crowds cheered the man who promised to make them proud again. Adolf Hitler stood before his people, hand raised, voice trembling with passion, declaring the dawn of a new age, the Third Reich. To millions, he was not a dictator, he was a savior. He spoke of destiny, of unity, of a nation wronged and finally rising. And in those first years, he appeared to deliver exactly what he promised. Factories reopened, unemployment dropped, roads, bridges, and stadiums were built across the country. The world saw images of discipline and progress, shining parades, happy workers, proud soldiers. But beneath the surface, fear ruled everything. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, spread through every town and city. They listened, they watched, they whispered. Neighbors feared each other. A careless joke could mean a midnight knock on the door and a train ride that no one returned from. The first victims were political opponents, communists, social democrats, unionists. Then came journalists, intellectuals, and artists. Soon, anyone who didn't fit into Hitler's vision of Germany, especially the Jewish people, became targets. Across Germany, Jewish businesses were boycotted. Books were burned. Children in schools were taught that Jews were inferior. Propaganda posters painted them as the source of all Germany's suffering. And while the civilized world watched in discomfort, most said nothing. The Nazi propaganda machine, led by Joseph Goebbels, worked relentlessly. Every newspaper, every film, every radio broadcast told the same story. Germany was strong again, and Hitler was its chosen leader. Truth no longer mattered, only loyalty did. But Hitler's ambitions went far beyond words. In secret, he began rebuilding Germany's military, the Wehrmacht. Factories once making tractors now produced tanks. Airfields sprang up, disguised as sports facilities. In the shadows of Europe, a war machine was awakening. And the world, it looked away. The League of Nations, born to keep peace after World War I, had no power, no army, and no unity. Its warnings were empty, its resolutions ignored. Britain and France, still haunted by the slaughter of the trenches, avoided confrontation at all costs. They told themselves Hitler was only restoring pride, not preparing for war. In 1935, Hitler made his intentions clear. He announced the creation of a new German air force, the Luftwaffe, and introduced conscription. Both actions directly violated the Treaty of Versailles. The Allies protested and did nothing. Encouraged, Hitler took his next gamble. On a cold March morning in 1936, German troops marched into the Rhineland, a demilitarized zone meant to serve as a buffer between Germany and France. It was a bold move and a massive risk. Hitler's generals warned him that if France resisted, Germany would have to retreat. But France did nothing. Britain stayed silent. The gamble paid off. The German people saw it as a miracle. Their country had taken back its own land without a single shot fired. Hitler's popularity soared to unimaginable heights. He told his generals, if the French had marched, we would have had to withdraw with our tails between our legs. But they did not march. The message was clear. The world feared him more than he feared them. At the same time, Europe's political landscape was changing in ways that would make war almost inevitable. In the Soviet Union, Joseph Stalin ruled through terror, purging his army, his government, and his people. In Italy, Mussolini was dreaming of empire, sending his troops to invade Ethiopia in 1935. The League of Nations condemned the invasion but refused to act. Sanctions were weak, ineffective, and temporary. By the time Ethiopia fell, fascism had proven something dangerous. Violence worked, and no one would stop it. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, the United States watched from afar. The American people, scarred by the Great Depression and the memory of World War I, wanted no part in Europe's affairs. They turned inward, passing neutrality laws that forbade their government from getting involved in foreign wars. The stage was being set for disaster, one side arming for domination, the other side refusing to see it coming. And while dictators rose, democracy faltered. In France and Britain, political divisions paralyzed action. In Spain, democracy collapsed entirely. By 1936, Spain was at war with itself, the Spanish Civil War. Republicans, backed by the Soviet Union, fought against nationalists led by General Francisco Franco, supported by Germany and Italy. It became a testing ground for Hitler's war machine. The German Luftwaffe bombed Spanish towns, perfecting tactics they would soon unleash on Europe. The most infamous of these attacks was on the small town of Guernica. where thousands of civilians were killed from the air in a single afternoon. It was a warning to the world, and no one listened. By the end of 1936, Germany and Italy formalized their alliance, the Rome-Berlin Axis. It was not just a military pact, it was a declaration of shared destiny. Two nations bound by ideology, determined to rewrite the world through conquest. Across the globe, another power watched closely: Japan. In Asia, Japan had already seized Manchuria and was preparing for full-scale war in China. In 1936, they too joined Hitler's cause, signing the Anti-Comintern Pact, united against communism and, more importantly, against Western democracies. The world was dividing, freedom on one side, tyranny on the other, and yet many still clung to hope that peace could be saved. They told themselves the dictators only wanted respect, not war. They were wrong. In Berlin, the drums of rearmament thundered louder. Factories worked day and night. Children marched in the streets with swastika flags, singing songs of loyalty. The past humiliation of Versailles had been erased, replaced by the roar of engines, the stamping of boots, and the blind faith of millions. Germany was ready to fight again. The question was no longer if, but when. By 1936, Adolf Hitler had transformed Germany from a defeated nation into a powerhouse. His gambles had paid off. The Rhineland was remilitarized. His people adored him. And the world, afraid of another great war, had let him have his way. But to Hitler, Germany's borders were only temporary lines, barriers to be erased. He believed the German people were destined to rule over a greater empire, a living space, Lebensraum, stretching across Europe. He looked east, toward Austria, Czechoslovakia, and beyond. Every move from now on would push the world closer to the brink. The first step came from within his own blood, Austria. Hitler had been born there, in the small town of Braunau am Inn. And he always believed Austria and Germany were one people, separated by politics, not by identity. From the start of his rule, he sought to bring Austria home. Inside Austria, the Nazi Party had already begun to grow, spreading propaganda, organizing rallies, whispering promises of unity. In early 1938, the Austrian Chancellor, Kurt Schuschnigg, realized the threat. He knew what Hitler wanted, and he tried to resist. He planned a public referendum, asking the Austrian people if they wanted to remain independent. Hitler panicked. He couldn't risk losing that vote. He summoned Schuschnigg to meet him at his mountain retreat in Berchtesgaden. There, surrounded by armed guards and Nazi officials, Hitler humiliated him, shouting that Austria was full of traitors and communists. He demanded that Austrian Nazis be given control of the government, or else. Schuschnigg returned to Vienna, shaken. He called the referendum anyway, hoping his people would choose freedom. They never got the chance. On March 12, 1938, before dawn, German troops crossed the Austrian border. There was no resistance. Instead, the streets filled with cheering crowds, flowers, and salutes. Many Austrians welcomed the Nazis, believing unification would bring prosperity and pride. The next day, Hitler entered Vienna in triumph, greeted by ecstatic masses. He declared, "As leader and chancellor of the German nation and the Reich, I announce to German history the entry of my homeland into the German Reich." Austria had vanished, absorbed into Germany without a single shot fired. The world's reaction was disbelief. Britain and France protested, but did nothing. The League of Nations once again proved powerless. And so Hitler learned another lesson: that aggression, when dressed as destiny, would not be stopped. The Anschluss, as it was called, gave him confidence and resources. Austria's factories, soldiers, and wealth were now his. But he wanted more. Next on his list was Czechoslovakia. To Hitler, Czechoslovakia was an artificial creation, a country born from the Treaty of Versailles, full of ethnic Germans in its western region, known as the Sudetenland. He claimed these people were suffering under Czech rule and that it was Germany's duty to protect them. It was the same lie he would use again and again. Inside Czechoslovakia, the government watched in growing terror. They had alliances with France and the Soviet Union. Both promised to defend them if Germany attacked. But promises are only as strong as the will to keep them. Throughout 1938, tension built. Hitler's speeches grew louder, his threats more open. In Germany, propaganda films showed Sudeten Germans as victims. In Britain and France, leaders debated what to do and chose appeasement. The man who embodied that policy was Neville Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister. He believed Hitler could be reasoned with, that if Germany was given what it wanted peacefully, it would be satisfied. He feared another world war, one that could destroy civilization itself. And so, as Europe held its breath, Chamberlain and French leaders agreed to meet Hitler. The result was one of the most infamous meetings in modern history, the Munich Conference. In September 1938, in a room filled with smiles, signatures, and lies, Britain and France handed over the Sudetenland to Germany. Czechoslovakia was not even invited to the table. Hitler promised this would be his last territorial demand in Europe. Chamberlain returned home to cheering crowds, waving the paper and declaring, "Peace for our time." But there was no peace. Within months, Hitler broke his word. In March 1939, German troops marched into Prague, occupying the rest of Czechoslovakia. This time, there were no excuses about protecting Germans. This was conquest, pure and simple. And finally, the world began to understand what Hitler truly wanted. The betrayal of Munich shattered Britain's illusion of peace. Chamberlain felt deceived, humiliated, and betrayed. France, too, realized that words meant nothing to Hitler. Both countries began to rearm, but it was too late to stop what was coming. In Berlin, the Nazi leader smiled. He had humiliated the West, expanded his empire, and met no serious resistance. Germany's power had grown beyond anyone's imagination, and soon he would make one last move that would plunge the world into chaos. But before he turned west, Hitler looked east, toward Poland. To take Poland, he knew he risked war with Britain and France. So he needed an ally, one that could guarantee his eastern flank. And he found it in the most unlikely of places, Moscow. Europe had traded honor for peace and gained neither. The ink on the Munich Agreement was barely dry when Hitler broke his promises. In March 1939, German tanks rolled into Prague, the proud capital of Czechoslovakia. There were no cheers this time, no smiling crowds with flowers, only silence. A small nation, betrayed by its allies, swallowed whole. The world had seen enough to understand the truth. Hitler could not be appeased. He did not want peace. He wanted domination. Britain and France finally woke from their dream. They issued guarantees to Poland, promising to defend it if Germany attacked. But deep down, everyone knew they were unprepared. Their armies were small, their air forces outdated, their people still traumatized by the last war. And Hitler knew it too. Still, he hesitated. Invading Poland meant war on two fronts, west against Britain and France, east against the Soviet Union. That was suicide. unless he could find a way to make the East safe. So, in a move that shocked the world, Hitler reached out to his greatest ideological enemy, Joseph Stalin. The two dictators despised each other, but they shared a common interest: time, land, and power. Through secret negotiations, they struck a deal that would change history. On the night of August 23, 1939, in the grand halls of the Kremlin, German and Soviet diplomats signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, a non-aggression agreement between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. But the real secret lay in the fine print, a hidden clause dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Poland would be split in half. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania would fall to Stalin, and Hitler would be free to unleash war on the West without fear of the East. The world was stunned. Communists and fascists, sworn enemies, now stood side by side. It was a cynical alliance born not of trust, but of opportunity. Hitler smiled. He had secured his rear. Now, nothing stood in his way. And so, the countdown began. In late August, German troops massed on Poland's borders. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers, thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, and the deadly new weapon that would define this war: the Luftwaffe, Hitler's air force. Inside Germany, propaganda blared on every radio. They spoke of Polish aggression, of German minorities being mistreated. It was all a lie, crafted to justify the inevitable. Then, on the night of August 31st, 1939, the Nazis staged one final deception. German operatives dressed in Polish uniforms attacked a German radio station near the border. They left behind the bodies of concentration camp prisoners dressed as Polish soldiers. The next morning, German newspapers screamed that Poland had attacked first. It was the excuse Hitler needed. At dawn, September 1st, 1939, the world changed forever. Without warning, German bombers roared across the Polish sky. Cities were set ablaze. Railways, bridges, and roads were shattered in hours. The Blitzkrieg, lightning war, had begun. In every direction, German forces advanced with terrifying speed. Armored divisions cut through the countryside, encircling entire Polish armies. The Luftwaffe dominated the skies, striking refugees, hospitals, and anything that moved. In just days, the Polish defense began to collapse. In London and Paris, the leaders watched in horror. For 2 days, they sent desperate ultimatums to Berlin: withdraw your troops or face war. Hitler ignored them. And so, on September 3rd, 1939, Britain and France declared war on Germany. Church bells rang across London. Crowds gathered in silence. There was no celebration, no patriotic rush like in 1914. Only a deep, grim understanding that the world had failed again. The Second World War had begun. In Warsaw, the city burned. Families huddled in cellars as bombs fell day and night. Polish soldiers fought bravely, hopelessly outnumbered. And just when they thought things couldn't get worse, they did. On September 17th, Soviet troops invaded Poland from the east. Hitler and Stalin's secret pact came to life. Poland was crushed between two invading giants, its people left to fate. By the end of the month, the country was gone. Divided, occupied, erased from the map. For the Polish people, it was the beginning of years of unimaginable suffering, executions, deportations, and the first seeds of what would become the Holocaust. In Berlin, Hitler stood victorious. His gamble had worked once again. He had defied Britain and France, and lived. He believed they would not fight seriously, that they would settle for words, as they always had. He was wrong. Though the West moved slowly, war had truly begun. But for now, the guns in Western Europe were silent. The press called it the phony war. Behind the front lines, soldiers waited, nervous, cold, uncertain of what would come next. In the months that followed, Germany prepared for its next move. Denmark, Norway, the Low Countries, all were within reach. France, the old enemy, was next on Hitler's list. And far across the Atlantic, in America, people listened to the news, hoping it was another distant European tragedy, unaware that soon the flames would reach them too. The peace that had been promised in Munich was dead. Appeasement had failed, and the world was now sliding into a nightmare unlike any it had ever known. Poland's fall was swift, brutal, and total. In just over 4 weeks, the German army had done what had taken years in the Great War. Cities burned, villages vanished, and the people of Poland, brave, proud, unprepared, were crushed between two empires that had promised to destroy them. In the west, German panzers rolled through endless fields, cutting through defenses like a blade through paper. In the east, Soviet troops poured across the border, rounding up officers, politicians, and civilians alike. There was no escape, no mercy, and no one coming to save them. The world watched in horror, but too late. Britain and France had declared war, but their armies did not yet move. They stood behind their defenses, waiting, watching. A grim calm settled over Europe. Newspapers called it the phony war, a strange silence after the storm. No great battles, no invasions in the West. Just cold winds, nervous soldiers, and the uneasy sense that something much worse was coming. Across the Maginot Line, a colossal wall of French fortresses, soldiers smoked cigarettes, played cards, and stared across no man's land toward the German lines. They joked it would all be over by Christmas. They were wrong, because while the Allies waited, Hitler was already planning his next strike. He called it Fall Gelb, Case Yellow, the invasion of Western Europe. But before striking west, he turned north. In April 1940, German warships appeared off the coasts of Denmark and Norway. Within hours, Denmark fell. Within days, Norway followed. The world was stunned again. Hitler's armies moved like a machine. Precise, fearless, unstoppable. In Berlin, crowds cheered. In London and Paris, fear turned to panic. And in the skies above Europe, the Luftwaffe grew stronger every day. But this new war would not be fought only with armies and tanks. It would be a war of entire nations, of civilians, factories, farms, and hearts. A war where no one would be safe. As German troops marched deeper into Europe, a new kind of terror followed behind them. The SS and the Gestapo. They arrested politicians, priests, and anyone who dared speak out. In the shadows, the first ghettos were established for Europe's Jews. Walled-off districts where hunger and disease spread like wildfire. What began as persecution would soon become genocide. Yet even in the darkness, courage flickered. In Poland, resistance movements formed. Small groups of men and women who refused to surrender. They smuggled intelligence to the Allies, sabotaged rail lines, and printed secret newspapers. Their weapons were few, but their resolve was unbreakable. For them, the fight was far from over. Meanwhile, across the Channel, Britain prepared for the storm. Winston Churchill, once dismissed as a warmonger, warned Parliament, "You cannot reason with a tiger when your head is in its mouth." He knew what was coming, and soon the world would too, because Hitler's victory in Poland was only the beginning. In his mind, destiny was unfolding exactly as planned. He had defied the Treaty of Versailles. He had conquered his neighbors. And now he believed he could reshape the world. In secret, his generals refined the strategy that would shock humanity. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, a doctrine built on speed, surprise, and total destruction. Tanks, planes, and infantry working as one. A storm of steel and fire. No defense could hold. No army could match it. In May 1940, Hitler unleashed that storm on the West. German tanks burst through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies believed impassable. Within days, France's defenses crumbled. The British army, trapped on the beaches of Dunkirk, faced annihilation. The world that had tried so hard to avoid war was now drowning in it. Across the oceans in the United States, the news came by radio. Americans listened as Europe fell, country by country. President Franklin D. Roosevelt urged preparedness, but his people were weary. They did not yet know that within 2 years, their sons too would fight on foreign soil. And as the smoke of Poland's cities faded into the grey sky, the war expanded. It was no longer about borders. It was about ideology, survival, and the future of civilization itself. From the snows of Finland to the deserts of Africa, from the skies of London to the islands of the Pacific, humanity was about to wage the deadliest conflict in its history. Over the next 6 years, more than 70 million lives would be lost. Cities would vanish. Nations would burn. But out of that fire, new heroes would rise, new alliances would form, and the world itself would be reborn. The invasion of Poland was the spark, but what it ignited would consume the earth. The Second World War had begun.